The meeting was supposed to be about a young employee's Instagram picture. Instead, it ended with senior management opening Susan's social media account. And suddenly, the woman who loved reminding everyone how long she had worked there had a very serious problem of her own. And the best part? I didn't have to attack her. I just asked HR to use the same standard on everyone. If you've ever watched someone in authority pick on the easiest person in the room while ignoring their own hypocrisy, you're going to enjoy this one. Hit like, subscribe, and settle in, because this is a story about what happens when you demand that the rules apply to everyone, not just the people someone happens to dislike. When I first started working with Susan, I honestly thought she was nice. She was older than me, experienced, and had been with the company for years. At first, I assumed that meant she would be someone I could learn from. But over time, I started noticing something. Susan didn't seem to like younger employees. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was a sarcastic comment. Sometimes it was the way she talked down to someone. Sometimes she'd remind everyone that she'd been with the company forever, almost as if her years of service gave her permission to treat newer employees differently. And the frustrating part was that Susan wasn't terrible at her actual job. She could do the work. She knew the company. She knew the procedures. But working alongside her could be exhausting. You never quite knew when a normal conversation would turn into an argument or a lecture. I learned to keep my interactions with her professional. Smile. Do the work. Move on. Then something changed. I got promoted to assistant manager. And suddenly, I wasn't just another coworker Susan could talk down to. I had responsibilities. I was sitting in meetings I hadn't previously been invited to. And one of those meetings would eventually turn this entire situation upside down. There was a young woman who had recently joined the company. She was new. She was doing her job. As far as I knew, there weren't any performance issues. But during a meeting with HR and senior management, somebody brought up her social media profile picture. Apparently, HR didn't like it. It was a picture from some party. She was dressed in a way they considered somewhat revealing, and she was making what they described as a seductive facial expression. And HR had actually put the picture up on a television screen in the meeting room. I remember looking at the screen and thinking, seriously? We're sitting around a table discussing a new employee's Instagram picture? Not her work. Not her performance. Not whether she had violated an actual company rule. Her personal social media picture. And what bothered me most wasn't even the picture. It was the principle. Because if someone had found the picture offensive, that was one thing. But humiliating a young employee by putting her personal photograph on a large screen in front of managers felt completely unnecessary. I could almost imagine how she'd feel if she discovered that a room full of senior employees had been sitting there analyzing her appearance. Her stomach would drop. Her face would burn. She might wonder what everyone was saying about her behind her back. And I couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged by a standard that wasn't clearly written anywhere. So I spoke. I explained that, as far as I understood it, our company policy didn't contain some broad rule saying employees had to maintain a particular appearance on their personal social media. She was doing her job. She wasn't causing problems. And if the company was going to start policing people's private social media accounts, then we needed to be very careful about where that road led. Because once you open that door, you can't just inspect the social media of the people you don't like. You have to be prepared to look at everyone's. And that's when I remembered Susan. I knew she and I followed each other on Instagram, and I'd seen some of the things she reposted. Normally, I ignored them. People are entitled to their political opinions. I'm personally conservative myself, so this wasn't about someone having conservative views. But some of Susan's posts went far beyond ordinary political disagreement. We work in Canada, which is an extremely diverse country, and Susan had reposted material expressing hostility toward immigrants and, in particular, posts complaining about there being too many Indians in Canada. Some of the material was so extreme that even though I personally vote conservative, I found it offensive. And suddenly I realized something. If HR was going to judge an employee based on her social media, then shouldn't they at least apply the same scrutiny to Susan? So I said it. I told them, essentially, if we're going to review people's social media, then you should look at Susan's too. The room went quiet. Not dramatically. Not like in a movie. It was more subtle than that. But you could feel the temperature change. Because Susan wasn't some brand new employee. She'd been with the company for years. And the HR representative involved happened to be friendly with Susan. That made me even more uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to get Susan fired. Honestly, I wasn't. I knew she could be difficult. But I also knew she was generally competent at her job. My point was simple. If this is a workplace standard, it needs to be a workplace standard for everybody. Not just the young woman who happened to have a picture HR didn't like. And then senior management did something I didn't expect. They actually took my suggestion seriously. They started looking at Susan's reposts, one by one. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about the new employee anymore. It was about Susan. You could almost feel the irony sitting in the room. The woman who constantly emphasized her years with the company had apparently never considered that her own public social media activity could become part of a workplace discussion. The more they reviewed, the more uncomfortable things became. Again, this wasn't simply, she has a different political opinion. It was the nature of some of the material she was sharing. Content targeting immigrants. Content expressing hostility toward particular ethnic groups. Statements that, in a diverse workplace, could potentially create a serious HR concern. And suddenly the argument I'd made became impossible to ignore. If a young woman could be publicly scrutinized because someone didn't like the way she posed in a photograph, what happens when an established employee is publicly sharing material that could actually affect how coworkers from different backgrounds feel in the workplace? That was the question. And I didn't even need to answer it. Senior management was already thinking about it. Then came the moment that made everything even more satisfying. The senior manager opened his own Facebook account. He pulled up a picture of himself at the beach with his family. There he was, relaxing, hairy chest and all. He looked at the picture and basically said, "So, are we having an HR meeting about this too?" That moment completely changed the atmosphere. Because now the hypocrisy was impossible to miss. If the standard was that personal social media photographs had to meet some imaginary professional dress code, then apparently half the company was going to need an HR meeting. The manager wasn't being disrespectful. He was making a point, powerful one. Where exactly does this end? Do we investigate someone's beach picture? Their vacation photo? Their political repost? Their joke? Their facial expression? Their clothing? Their friends? Their personal life? And if we're going to do that, shouldn't we have a clear policy first? That's what I had been trying to say from the beginning. The problem wasn't simply Susan. The problem wasn't even the young woman's photograph. The problem was the double standard. The HR representative was now in an awkward position too. She was friends with Susan. She had been part of the discussion about the young employee. And now Susan's own social media was being reviewed. The same process that had been used to scrutinize someone else had suddenly landed much closer to home. I remember thinking about how different the room probably felt for Susan compared with that new employee. The new employee had no idea her picture was being displayed and discussed. Susan, meanwhile, had spent years believing her position in the company gave her a certain amount of security. But social media doesn't care how long you've worked somewhere. Once you publicly post something, you don't necessarily control who eventually sees it. And that was the lesson playing out right in front of us. Nobody had hacked Susan's account. Nobody had invaded her privacy. Nobody fabricated anything. They simply looked at the same public material that she had chosen to share. That's why I didn't feel guilty. I hadn't lied about her. I hadn't edited screenshots. I hadn't created some elaborate scheme to destroy her career. I had simply challenged an inconsistent standard. If you're going to inspect one person's social media, be prepared to inspect everyone's. And now management was doing exactly that. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Susan get embarrassed. It was watching the conversation finally become fair. The young employee's picture was no longer being treated like some massive workplace scandal. Instead, management had to confront the much bigger question. What actually matters at work? Does someone's personal photograph determine whether they're professional? Or should we judge employees primarily by their conduct, performance, and whether they actually violate company policy? And if social media genuinely matters, then the company needs clear rules that apply consistently. not rules invented during one meeting because somebody didn't like a picture. As for Susan, her social media reposts were now being reviewed by the very HR person who was close to her. And suddenly, the person who had seemed untouchable wasn't quite so untouchable anymore. I didn't celebrate anyone losing their job. That wasn't the point. The satisfaction came from something much simpler. For once, someone had said, "Hold on. If we're doing this to her, why aren't we doing it to everyone?" And senior management actually listened. The real payoff wasn't Susan being publicly humiliated. It was the moment the standard turned around. The room had started with managers examining a young woman's appearance. It ended with senior management examining the social media of a longtime employee whose posts raised far more serious concerns. And the person who had initially been the easiest target was no longer standing alone. Even the senior manager had essentially put himself on the chopping block by showing his own beach photograph. His message was clear. If this is the standard, apply it to me too. That was the moment I knew the argument had been won. Not because Susan had been punished, but because the conversation had finally become about fairness. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply refusing to let someone else be singled out. If a rule is important enough to use against one employee, it should be important enough to apply to everyone, including the people who thought they were untouchable. And that's what made this one so satisfying. Nobody needed to scream. Nobody needed to threaten anyone. The double standard simply collapsed under its own weight. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Would you have spoken up in that meeting? Or stayed completely silent? And if you want more Reddit revenge stories where karma arrives in the most unexpected way, stick around. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people expose themselves.